everybody, welcome to Coffee Time Q&A. I'm Pastor Steve Roby, and I got my man back with me, the Mad Hatter.
Hey guys, how's it going?
Adam Rastatter. Missed you last week.
I missed being here. You guys did a great job, you and Carrie.
That was fun. I was glad Carrie was able to come on. It was a good conversation.
Absolutely.
But you're back, and we are going to drink this fine coffee from Fathom once again, but this is a different coffee. This is a blend, which is abnormal. Rodney's usually a single origin guy. This is Fathom Coffee's BCB Espresso. So it's going to be strong. A lot of caffeine, I bet. It's Brazilian, Colombian, and Bali. That's the BCB.
That sounds like Rodney's kind of coffee.
Yeah, for sure.
Strong and caffeinated. Right?
Cheers, mate.
Cheers. That away, Rodney.
It is good. I don't think it's quite as smooth as the other one, but I do dig it. It's definitely good. So we got a question from a member of our church.
We do. Here, let me read that for us here. How was the Bible put together? Who decided what books became the Bible, especially relating to the New Testament? Do Bible scholars know what year the Bible was truly put together in one book? So we got a couple questions there. How was it put together? How was the Bible put together? Secondly, who decided what books became the Bible, especially the New Testament? And then, do Bible scholars know the year the Bible was truly put together in one book? So let's...
Yeah, so this is a question that, can be troublesome if people don't understand, like, the human element that went into the formation of the Bible. But in no way does that diminish the God-inspired writings of the Scriptures.
Right.
And so we'll talk about it. The first part, I know she's kind of gearing her question primarily at the New Testament. But before we do that, we should comment at least on the Old Testament. You had some thoughts about the formation of the Old Testament and...
Yeah, well, the 39 books of the Old Testament we know were generally accepted by the time of Jesus' birth. Malachi was the last book written in around the year 400 BC, so we have about 400 years, and during that time, it was pretty well accepted which books were the Old Testament. The Jewish leaders, Pharisees, they would have all agreed on these 39 books. They were officially recognized after the destruction of the temple in 90 AD, the councils of Jamnia. They give a final affirmation of those 39 books in the Old Testament.
That would have been important after the destruction of the temple, for sure, which was the centralized worship, center of Judaism. Right.
So we have that official then, but how many of the New Testaments were quoting these 39 books?
There's tons. I think there are hundreds of quotations from the Old Testament in the New Testament. And I think one of the ways we know that it was somewhat settled is this was never a matter of dispute for Jesus and the religious leaders of his day.
Right.
Because they had a lot of different disputes about different things and different teachings from the Old Testament.
But not on this.
But not on the canon itself. It seems like the scriptures were settled, they were authoritative, and that was just known and accepted among Jesus and his followers and among, Jews of the first century.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a quote from Josephus, and he wrote, "For although such long ages have now passed, no one has ventured neither to add or to remove or to alter a syllable." So he's saying we have it's complete, it's here. The Old Testament he's referring to.
Yeah, and he's the leading Jewish historian.
Right.
Most of what we know about Judaism is from him, like the earlier years,
right?
Particularly around the time of Jesus in the first century.
Yeah.
And so Josephus referencing this period of silence, I think is significant. We were kind of talking about that a little bit because so much of the Old Testament points to Christ, right? And so if that's the case, then I think it's meaningful that there was this anticipation that was built for his arrival, not this like, oh, let me have these prophecies and then, the next day Jesus appears on the scene, to where there was this longing for and this anticipation of the Messiah that was to come. When you think about the scriptures, all of what we have recorded in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, it's from a meta narrative, like an over kind of 50,000 foot view. You have the history of redemption, God's mighty deeds being recorded in Scripture that move forward this progression of his redemptive plan, which Scripture says was, put forth before the foundation of the world was laid. And yet in the Bible, what we see is primarily these major events and the details and stories surrounding them, commenting on from the very words of God, right? All of these major events. And so it starts in Genesis. You got the creation narrative. Where God creates man, man sins. There's this enmity between God and man.
Right.
And then you have in Genesis, God calling Abraham out of Ur to establish a people for himself,
Right.
The Jewish nation. And he changes Abram's name to Abraham, and he says to him that through his seed, like all the families of the earth are going to be blessed.
Yeah.
And so you have his story, and then you have his people ended up in Egypt, and then in the next book of the Bible, you have Exodus, the mighty, deliverance of the Israelites from Egypt, and all the commentary around that, and the laws given. Then you have his people wandering in the wilderness, the conquest of Canaan in the book of Joshua, the time of the judges. And then you have the establishment of the monarchy. And then you have the exiles, like the judgment brought on them, first through the Assyrians in 722, and then the Babylonian exile in 586, and then the return from captivity. And then once worship is reestablished, there's a period of silence.
Yeah.
And then it just sits for 400 years, or from the end of Malachi to the opening of the New Testament. So there's this anticipation that the story's not done. There's more yet to come.
This coming Messiah.
Yeah, and by
promised.
the time we get to the New Testament, then there is a general expectation. It would only make sense if God is again progressing in the redemptive act of mankind, that these events also would be recorded. The establishment of the new covenant. So the arrangement of the old covenant is documented throughout the Old Testament. It only makes sense that the arrangements of the new covenant would be documented once the Messiah comes, once salvation is achieved. And so that's kind of where we are.
Right.
How do we get the New Testament then? Yeah.
Yeah, so now Jesus comes. He's accomplished what he came to accomplish through his death and resurrection, ascension, and now the church is beginning. Pentecost and things are happening. The gospel spreading to the
Pentecost is significant because that's the sending of the Spirit, which he promised in John that would do what?
Right. It would empower to spread to the Gentiles, right?
Yeah, he tells them that he's going to send the Spirit, and the Spirit is going to help them recall everything that he taught them.
Right.
And he's going to guide them, it says in John 16, into all truth.
Yeah.
And so you have Jesus promising his disciples that they will receive the Spirit at a future time, and that Spirit's going to guide them into all truth. So with the New Testament canon then, that would be the establishment of sort of the apostolic teaching of the church concerning the new covenant.
Right. So then they start writing. We have Mark, writing, spending time with Peter and writing his gospel. The other gospel writers writing. We have Paul's conversion that we see Luke write about in Acts and all of the letters that Paul writes, and so. And these letters begin circulating to the churches. The churches recognize these immediately as inspired scripture. We know even within those writings, 2 Peter writes about how he refers to something that Luke writes in Luke 10:17.
That's in 1 Timothy.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say 2 Timothy?
You said 2 Peter.
Oh, I'm sorry. So 2 Peter is 2 Peter 3:16. He refers to scripture, right? Peter does.
Calls Paul's writing scripture.
Paul's writing scripture. And then it's 1 Timothy 5:18 is when 1 Timothy actually refers to something that Luke said. He says that the scripture says the laborers deserve his wages. So he's quoting from Luke chapter 10 there, Luke 10:17. So these even writers of the New Testament are referring to other New Testament writings as scripture. So just to say that they were recognizing these as scriptures right then, like in that first century.
And that recognition is tied to apostolic authority, right? So of the 27 books that Protestants recognize of the New Testament, of the 27 books of the New Testament, 22 of them are directly tied to an apostle that they wrote. You have Matthew writing, he was an apostle.
Yeah.
You have John writing 5 books. You got Paul, the apostles, all of his epistles. You got Peter's. The only 5 that aren't directly written by an apostle, that's if you accept traditional authorship, are Mark, Luke, Acts, Hebrews, and Jude. Right. And all of those you can find ties to the apostles. So like Mark, as you mentioned, he was closely associated with Peter. We know the early church met in Mark's home. Peter was definitely a leader of the church in Jerusalem at that time. So there was a close association there. You have Luke and writing some of the events that he witnessed in Acts. You get to the we passages, so he's an eyewitness to half the book of Acts once he becomes a companion of Paul. But he has, even though he's not an apostle, his writing is apostolic because he was such a close companion of the apostle Paul. And then you have Jude, who was the half-brother of Jesus, also the brother of James, who was recognized as an authoritative leader and apostle in the early church. You see them deferring to James in Acts 15 at the Jerusalem Council. So his association with Jesus and James gives him, even though he's not an apostle, apostolic authority. There's a sort of a apostolic nature to his writing. And then you have the book of Hebrews, which, early on they attributed to Paul, but most scholars don't recognize, Paul is the author of that. But whoever wrote Hebrews certainly claims to be apostolic in the sense of having received from the apostles the teaching that they're putting forth. And I'll quote that from Hebrews chapter 2. In Hebrews chapter 2, it says, "It was declared at first by the Lord." It's talking about this great salvation, the gospel. "It was declared at first by the Lord, and it was attested to us by those who heard." Right. And so this is kind of second generation of, we've heard the apostles' teaching. Let me write to you all that they taught. And it was widely, accepted as well. And so apostolic authority, continuity with the Old Testament, and this is why many of the books would be rejected. That we'll kind of talk about some of the extra books that people wonder why those weren't included in the Bible. And then, just a general sense of God breathed. So if you think of these 3, this framework for recognizing Scripture, that you have this of the New Testament, you have apostolic authority, you have continuity with the Old Testament, that there's a sense in which this story is moving forward and being completed that began under the Old Covenant. Now we have the New Covenant arrangement. And then you have this sense of inspiration, that there is and this might seem subjective to some people, but I think this matters because Jesus said, my sheep will hear my voice, they'll know my voice. There's this sort of internal witness of the inspiration of the Spirit to the believer in the writings. That's the most subjective of the 3, but when you put those all together, I think you can get a pretty compelling case for recognizing Scripture. And the early church didn't just casually, acknowledge these things. Like, they were pretty rigorous in terms of acknowledging what was and what wasn't Scripture. For sure.
Yeah. I think the hand of God's providence is all over this, and certainly, he wanted us to know and to have these words, His word, and I think in the second century, then, as churches had generally, there was a consensus. Okay, we know this is Scripture. This came from an apostolic source, and we use it in our churches, in our gatherings. We're considering it we're considering it Scripture, just as the Old Testament. And so now in the second century, they begin to start to define those. Some of the books. I think 22 out of the 27 were listed. Is that right?
Yeah. So there's a fragment that was discovered in the 18th century. It was a second century document, a fragment. It's referred to as the Muratorian Canon. That was the name of the guy that found it in the 18th century. He was an Italian historian. And in that fragment, you have a list of books, most of which are the books that we have. Certainly in the second century, what we know is that the four Gospels were well established as being the fourfold picture of the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Christ. That's attested in the Muratorian canon. It's attested in Irenaeus' writings, in Clement's writings, in Tertullian's writings. These early church fathers acknowledge these four Gospels. What's beautiful in the second century, and the reason we can understand our 27 books as being authoritative and being the right ones, is that a lot of the writings, the vast majority of writings in the second century, Christian writings, are quoting from these 27 books, like significantly. I've actually even heard one scholar, the name's going to escape me now, but who once said that even if we lost all of our Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, we could almost reconstruct the entire New Testament based off of second century quotes from the Bible. And so I would point people to a scholar named Michael Kruger, Dr. Michael Kruger. He has written several books on the canon of the New Testament. He's the president, and he's a New Testament professor at the Reformed Theological Seminary. The best book, I think, out there on this is a book he wrote called Canon Revisited. He also wrote a book called The Question of Canon. He addresses a lot of modern critical scholars who would argue for like a lot of the Gnostic Gospels to be included in the Bible, like the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, and all of these writings that came much later. Right. But Kruger would say they're in the first century, like honest scholarship would date all of those other writings much later. At least in the second century to later second century, and many in the third. Mm-hmm. And the only Christian writings that we can, with integrity, attribute to the first century are the 27 books that we have in our New Testament. And there's one other from Clement. First Clement was written at the latter part of the first century, but wasn't recognized, as scriptural. And so I think that's really important to note. Mm-hmm. So if the question is, when did we get the final list? How did we get this all put together? Now that comes later, but I think there's good reason for that. Now the first list we have of all 27 books isn't until 367.
Yep.
And that was by Athanasius.
Yep.
He documented all 27 books. He documented all 39 of the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And he referenced them as the Christian scriptures. You were going to say something?
That's you went right where I was thinking. Yeah, I think that so this is the first time that we actually have a list of all of the Old Testament and New Testament writings. The 66 books, the canon.
Yeah,
is
so it's in the year 367. That's 300 years, 300 years plus after the events of Jesus' life, and we'll talk about that. But following him, Athanasius, because that was just one man. 30 years later, you have an official recognition by the church, and that was at the Synod or the Council of Carthage.
Yep. Yeah. So they're establishing orthodoxy around the canon in this, and there was something, I think 4 years even earlier than that they were affirming something.
Yeah, it was called the Synod of Hippo in 393. Yeah. So when you see the affirmation at the Synod of Carthage or the Council of Carthage, it's quoting from 4 years earlier at the Synod of Hippo,
right?
The New Testament canon.
Yeah. So now they have this established canon. So that's the answer to the question. Really, we have 367 would have been the official, like we have the first.
Yeah, and I think for some people that's troublesome because it seems 300 years is a long time, but then you have to like really put yourself in the first century when all of this is happening. For the first 300 years of the church, it wasn't easy to be identified as a Christian. There was intense persecution. Now we're studying the book of Acts in our church, and we haven't gotten to, when persecution breaks out, but it's coming soon. Chapter 7, 8, and 9 of the stoning of Stephen. And then persecution breaks out, and then the church, it's all kind of huddled there in Jerusalem, starts spreading to the nations, and the gospel starts going forth. Yeah. Well, then for the next couple hundred years, you have Christians meeting sometimes in secret because of sanctioned persecution. We know that the Roman Empire, really tried to, put out Christianity, really tried to, smash it, and was unsuccessful. But it wasn't like they could all get together and have these church conferences and make these, official recognitions and things like that.
Yeah.
What was happening is these letters were being written in the first century.
Right.
And they were, once they were written and read out loud to their church, they would go pass them on to another church, and that the letters started circulating like that. And then over time, there's this official recognition. There's this recognition that's taking place that these have these requirements that we were talking about. These have the sense of being God-breathed. These have apostolic authority, and these have continuity with the Old Testament. And so it just kind of happens organically, where it's, just accepted that these are the authoritative scriptures that naturally follow the old covenant arrangements of the Old Testament now into the new covenant arrangements that Jesus has established in his church, which he said his Spirit would guide his apostles into all truth.
And all of these New Testament writings were written in the latter half of the first century. So about a 40-year time period.
Yeah, so you got all these Gnostic Gospels that are written, and it was guys like Dan Brown and the Da Vinci Code that kind of, sparked all of this modern criticism again, years ago. But there's some myths about the Council of Nicaea. I think it was on the Joe Rogan podcast that they were talking about how Constantine, the Roman emperor, becomes a Christian, and then he established the New Testament canon at the Council of Nicaea, and that's the whole reason they had the council. Well, there's no historical proof of any of that. Right. In fact, there wasn't even a topic of discussion at the Council of Nicaea. They were addressing specific heresies.
Right.
But what does happen is when Constantine is converted, the official sanctioned persecution of Christians ends. And so now the door is open to where we could start comparing, what letters did you have over in this church? What letters did you have over in this church? Oh, we had that letter. Yeah, Peter wrote that. Yeah, Paul wrote that. And so there becomes, over time, this ability to gather and talk about these things without fear of losing your life.
Right.
Well, the Constantine myth comes from a document from the 9th century. It's kind of humorous, actually. And it was from a kind of a pseudo-historical, fragment piece of literature that was found. And it says that at the Council of Nicaea, there's all kinds of legendary, kind of fanciful stuff in this document. But one of them references the Council of Nicaea, and it says that the 300 and I think it says 18 bishops came from around the world, and they brought all of the letters and all of the fragments and books, and they laid them on the altar of God. And they prayed like that the Lord would show them which ones are they supposed to follow, which ones are the Bible. And they prayed specifically that the ones that would go under the altar would be excluded, and the ones that would remain on top would be the Bible. And supposedly that's how it happened. And the 27 books that we have stayed on top, and all the other, pieces of literature went on underneath the altar. And so
that's all there was to it.
But then you get that stuff being perpetuated, throughout time. And then you got people who obviously want to criticize the Bible and try to tear it down. And you got modern scholarship, like guys who've left the faith, like Bart Ehrman, who's written extensively trying to discredit the Bible and Jesus' life and teachings. That's why I point to Dr. Kruger. There's several other good New Testament canon scholars that deal with all the textual critics. Bruce Metzger, recently deceased, was a wonderful textual critic scholar. But Dr. Kruger is probably, I think, the foremost sort of leading scholar right now on the canon and the formation of the Bible. And his books, I think, are probably the most helpful. We're having this conversation over coffee and kind of spitting it around. But if you really want to study it, I definitely would recommend reading one of his books, particularly Canon Revisited, because I think it'll put to rest, all of the question marks surrounding these other Gnostic Gospels that were written in the 2nd century or even later. Yeah. The only one that scholars have actually tried to make an attempt, I'm talking about the Gnostic Gospels. I think there's maybe a total of 17 in all. And the Gospel of Thomas is the one that at least there's been attempts to kind of date that into the 1st century and lend it some credibility, though. That should be the 5th gospel, and that should be included. but it bears no semblance of the other Gospels.
Right.
It doesn't even read like narrative form in the way Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John read. It's like a collection of sayings, and there's some weird stuff in the Gospel of Thomas if you've ever read it. I was telling you a couple of things that it talks about lions eating men, men eating lions, and it's just this weird teaching. And Peter's telling Jesus that women aren't worthy of life, and Jesus says that he's going to make them male and give them the spirit of life, and then they'll be worthy. It's just really bizarre, and it doesn't fit any of the sort of framework that I was laying out of apostolic authority, of sort of this God-breathed inspiration, the subjective part of, trusting the Spirit, hearing his voice. And certainly no consistency with the Old Testament. It doesn't even like reference back to the Old Testament in the way all the other Gospels do.
Right.
And so there is like significant, but in reality, even Bart Ehrman, one of the most critical scholars, would not put Thomas in the first century. He says that that's a second century document.
Yeah. And if that's the one that there is maybe has the best argument to get in, that's pretty clear. I think that 27.
Yeah, it's hard to make a serious case from scholarship that these books were written in the first century, where that's not the case in terms of the 27 books that we have, plus First Clement. And so what I believe is that, the earliest New Testament books written were James and Galatians, probably in the early 40s or mid 40s AD. And then you have the last one, depending on when you date it, but a lot of people would date the Revelation around 90 or maybe 95 latest. Then you only have like a 50-year period of these books being written versus the Old Testament, which happened over a period from like 1400 to around 400. Yeah. So you got a 1,000-year period versus like a 50-year really concentrated period of writings.
Yeah.
And it helps though in terms of like solidifying the scholarship behind trying to date these manuscripts. One of the other pieces we talked about was the amount of manuscripts. Because the church recognized, and I use the word recognized, not authorized. We talked about the difference between Protestant and Catholic views. Protestants would say that the canon of Scripture, the word canon is like a measurement or a standard.
Measuring rod.
Yeah. It's like literally a reed or a rod that was used as a measuring standard. So when we speak of the canon of Scripture, we're talking about all the books that should be in the Bible.
It's a standard of truth, right? It's kind of the way.
And it's just the list of books that are inspired by God. So we, as Protestants, would say these books have authority no matter if we put them in a list because they're God-breathed.
Right.
And the church's role, the human element, was simply recognizing that authority. Whereas the Catholic view, which holds church tradition along with scriptural tradition, is that the church officially authorized these books as Scripture. And so maybe could have chosen others. I'm not sure if I fully understand that, but there's a difference between recognizing and authorizing. And so the Protestant view would be that our job was merely to recognize what God had written through his apostles, inspired by the Spirit.
And these manuscripts that they had, these letters that were circulating amongst the churches, there's far more copies of these letters
than there are the Gnostics, or the second century documents. And that's another piece of evidence.
They placed a lot of importance, and they were wanting to get those books, those manuscripts to others.
Yeah, which is huge for textual criticism too, because the more copies we have, the more we can determine whether or not we have the originals based on textual criticism, kind of the scientific method behind that.
Right.
Because then you're going to get, just like any other document written in antiquity, the more manuscripts you have, the more you can see where minor copyist errors were made. And so when we say we have confidence in the Bible, it's because we have so many manuscripts, and when a word was misspelled or duplicated here or left off here, there's a human error that can be recognized because we have all these other manuscripts that we can compare them to. Yeah. And there's attestation of New Testament documents far exceeds any other documents in antiquity, so it's huge.
Yeah. So the reliability of the Bible is...
I don't think Christians should shy away from like trying to understand these and really studying these because it should serve to increase your confidence in the Scripture versus, make you shrink back, especially when you compare it to, how we view other ancient documents and what we hold as truth based on a few manuscripts versus thousands.
Yeah.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah. That's a great question.
It is a good question. Yeah, I hope we answered it in all of that, at least to some degree, for sure. Thanks for taking a listen. We are pastors at Water's Edge Church. This is a show that we started because we really wanted to have another opportunity to just kick around questions that members of our church had. Mm-hmm. But we see great value in putting this online and letting others submit questions as well. So thanks for watching and tuning in. If you haven't subscribed to our channel, we'd love for you to do that. Like this video, comment on it, help the algorithm. We certainly would love some engagement. Go to wc.life if you want us to talk about a question that you have. We'd love to do that. God bless you all. Yep. See you next week.
God bless.
Peace out.